A wonderless steak is usually a joke. I turned mine into something that chewed like a piece of meat 5 times its price. I used a spice already sitting in your pantry. My name is Samuel Mast. I farmed 200 acres of Amish land for 30 years. We raised our own cattle, but we never wasted the tough, cheap cuts either. Every part of that animal got used. Every part got tenderized using tricks passed down for generations. We never called a cut too tough to eat, not once. I left my community and started testing every trick I'd ever heard, including one that sounded almost too strange to work. Today, I'm telling you exactly what happened when I tried baking soda on the cheapest steak I could find. I went to a regular grocery store and found the cheapest piece of beef, a thin-cut eye of round steak. This is about as tough as beef gets. Eye of round comes from a heavily worked muscle with almost no fat. It's notorious for turning out chewy and dry, no matter how carefully you cook it using normal methods. I wanted a real test, not a cut that was already somewhat tender. I wanted the hardest possible starting point. If baking soda could fix something this difficult, it could fix almost anything sold at a grocery store meat counter. Baking soda is alkaline. Meat, in its natural state, sits on the acidic side of the pH scale. When you apply baking soda, it raises the pH, making it harder for the muscle fibers to tighten during cooking. This is different from salt brining. Baking soda works through pH change, directly altering how the proteins behave under heat. Amish farmers didn't have a name for pH, but this trick showed up in kitchens generations back. My grandmother used this on venison. She called it sweetening the meat, which I later understood was pure chemistry. I started with that $1 steak and patted it completely dry. Surface moisture can interfere with the baking soda. I measured 1 teaspoon of plain baking soda and sprinkled it evenly across both sides, rubbing it gently into the surface. I let the coated steak sit uncovered in the refrigerator for 20 minutes. This resting period matters more than you expect. Baking soda needs time to penetrate and work on the proteins. 20 minutes was enough for this thin cut. After 20 minutes, I rinsed the steak thoroughly under cold running water. This rinsing step is not optional. Leftover baking soda creates a soapy, chemical taste that would ruin the result, no matter how tender the meat. I patted the steak dry again. A wet steak steams instead of searing, undoing all our careful work. The surface had a different texture now, almost matte. This visual change told me something happened at a structural level. I seasoned it simply with salt and coarse black pepper. I wanted to isolate the baking soda's effect specifically. I heated a cast iron skillet on high for 5 minutes. Once it was properly hot, I placed the steak in the pan. I cooked it for 2 minutes per side. A thin cut like this can overcook quickly if you aren't paying attention. I pulled it off at medium doneness and let it rest for 5 minutes, giving the juices time to redistribute. I sliced against the grain, cutting thin strips perpendicular to the muscle fibers. Proper technique still matters. Next, I'll walk you through what that first bite told me and if this trick genuinely delivered on its promise. Now let's pick up exactly where we left off, standing over that cutting board with a sliced, baking soda treated steak in front of me. And an honest question I genuinely didn't know the answer to yet. Before I tell you about that first bite, I need to explain something I did that I haven't mentioned yet. Because it matters for how much you can actually trust what I'm about to tell you. I didn't just cook one steak. I bought 2 identical eye of round steaks from that same discounted package. Treated one with baking soda exactly the way I described in part 1. And cooked the other one completely untreated, using the exact same seasoning, the exact same hot cast iron pan, the the exact same cook time and resting period. Same source of meat, same day, same kitchen, only one variable changed between them. This matters because trying a method once and declaring it works, without any real comparison sitting right next to it, isn't a fair test. 30 years of handling meat taught me that your memory of how something tasted last week is not reliable enough to draw a real conclusion. You need both versions in front of you at the same time to know if a difference is actually real or if you're simply telling yourself what you expected to find. So there I was, 2 plates side by side. One steak treated with baking soda, sliced against the grain. One steak cooked completely plain, sliced the exact same way. Same cut, same price, same everything except that 20-minute baking soda treatment. I started with the untreated steak first, since I wanted a clear, honest baseline in my mouth before tasting anything that might have been altered. This is exactly what I expected from a dollar steak cooked without any special treatment. Chewy, in the specific way tough meat is chewy, where your jaw has to work through each bite rather than the meat simply giving way easily. Slightly dry, since eye of round has almost no internal fat to keep it moist through cooking. The flavor itself was fine, genuinely beefy, since flavor was never really the problem with this cut. The problem was always texture. Then I moved to the baking soda treated piece, and I want to describe this as precisely and honestly as I can, since exaggerating a result here would defeat the entire purpose of running this test in the first place. The difference was immediate and unmistakable from the very first bite. Where the untreated piece required real, sustained chewing, this piece gave way far more easily. Closer to what you'd expect from a mid-range cut like sirloin, rather than the toughest cut on the entire shelf. It wasn't magically transformed into a filet mignon. I want to be completely clear about that, since I don't believe in overselling a result just because it sounds more exciting. But the tenderness genuinely improved by a noticeable, significant margin, not a subtle difference you'd need to convince yourself was there. The texture specifically changed in a way that's hard to describe unless you've felt it yourself, but I'll try. Untreated eye of round has a texture almost like tightly wound rope, distinct fibers that resist coming apart cleanly, even when sliced correctly. The baking soda treated piece had a texture closer to a single, more uniform piece of meat. Those fibers still present but far less resistant, breaking apart smoothly rather than fighting against each bite. Now, let's talk about what I noticed regarding moisture, since this surprised me slightly compared to what I expected going in. I assumed that the baking soda treatment might make the meat taste slightly different. Perhaps duller or less distinctly beefy, since, altering pH, this directly seemed like it could affect flavor as much as texture. This wasn't the case. The flavor between both pieces was nearly identical, which makes sense once you understand that baking soda's effect is primarily structural, working on the proteins themselves rather than adding or removing flavor compounds the way a marinade or a rub would. Moisture-wise, the treated piece held on to slightly more juice than the untreated version, though this difference was less dramatic than the tenderness difference. This makes sense, given the actual chemistry. Baking soda's primary function here is altering protein structure to prevent tight muscle fiber binding during cooking, not directly increasing moisture retention the way a salt brine specifically targets. The moisture improvement was likely a secondary effect of that looser protein structure, allowing the meat to hold on to its juices. Let's talk about something else worth mentioning, honestly, since this whole video is about giving you an accurate account. The surface texture on the baking soda treated steak, right at the outer edge, was slightly different from a normal sear. Not in a bad way, but noticeably softer at that outermost layer compared to the firmer, more traditional crust you'd get from an untreated piece. This makes sense given that the baking soda's effect is strongest right at the surface, exactly where it made direct contact during that rest. This is worth knowing if you're expecting a completely normal steak crust. The overall sear still browned properly and looked appetizing. But if you're someone who prioritizes a very hard, deeply crusted exterior, this is a small trade-off worth understanding honestly. Let's talk about how this compares to other tenderizing methods I've taught you, since understanding where baking soda fits matters. Salt brining works primarily on moisture and takes longer, typically 30 to 45 minutes, for a meaningful effect. Baking soda worked faster, in just 20 minutes, and specifically targeted the tightness of the muscle fiber itself. These aren't really competing methods. They're solving slightly different aspects of the same overall toughness problem. And there's a real argument for combining both in a single treatment. Something worth testing once you understand how each one performs. Mechanical tenderizing, pounding with a meat mallet, breaks down muscle fiber through direct physical force. This works, but it also changes the shape and thickness of the meat, flattening it out in a way baking soda doesn't require. Marinating in an acidic liquid, like vinegar or citrus juice, works on the opposite end of the pH scale entirely. Acidic marinades typically need much longer to show a meaningful effect, often several hours rather than 20 minutes. So, here's my honest conclusion after running this test properly, with a real side-by-side comparison. Baking soda genuinely works on a tough, cheap cut of beef. This isn't an exaggerated internet trend built on nothing. The tenderness improvement was real, noticeable, and repeatable. Exactly the kind of result that makes a genuine difference. It's fast, using an ingredient that costs almost nothing and sits in nearly every kitchen already. And it requires no special equipment. It's not a miracle. It won't turn a $1 cut into something indistinguishable from a $30 ribeye. But it closes a meaningful part of that gap, taking one of the toughest cuts and making it genuinely enjoyable to eat. In the next part, I'll walk you through exact ratios and timing for different cuts, along with mistakes to avoid. See you there. Let's talk about ratios and timing now. Since the 20 minutes and 1 teaspoon I used in part 1 worked well for that specific thin cut. Different thicknesses and different cuts genuinely need different handling to get this right. The general ratio is 1 teaspoon of baking soda per pound of meat. Spread the baking soda evenly across the surface, rather than concentrated in one spot. This ratio holds steady whether you're treating a steak or a roast. The timing changes significantly depending on thickness, which matters more than the ratio itself once you're working with something beyond a simple half-inch cut. For thin cuts, anything under 3/4 of an inch thick, 20 minutes is the right window, exactly what I used in my own test. Going much beyond this risks over-treating the surface, pushing past tenderizing into a texture that turns unpleasantly soft and slightly slimy right at the surface. For medium cuts, between 3/4 of an inch and 1.5 inches thick, extend that resting time to closer to 30 to 45 minutes. The added thickness means the baking soda has more surface area relative to depth to work through, and 20 minutes often isn't enough time. For thicker cuts, anything over 1.5 inches, this method actually becomes less practical using surface application alone because of the interior mass. For a roast or thick cut, a baking soda solution mixed into water allows for a more even distribution throughout a larger piece of meat. Dissolve 1 tablespoon of baking soda into 4 cups of cold water, then fully submerge your roast in this solution, refrigerated, for 1 to 2 hours. This method works through the same basic pH principle, just distributed through a larger volume of liquid that can surround the entire cut evenly. Rinse thoroughly after this soak, exactly the same way I rinsed my dry-treated steak, since leftover baking soda residue causes a soapy taste. Let's talk about different cuts specifically. Bottom round and top round respond nearly identically to what I found in my own test. Flank steak and skirt steak benefit from a shorter treatment window, closer to 15 minutes, since these cuts are naturally thinner. Chuck steak, which has more natural marbling, shows a slightly less dramatic improvement because the fat already does some of that tenderizing work. Ground beef also responds well. A quarter teaspoon of baking soda mixed into 1 pound of beef produces a noticeably juicier, more tender result. The most common mistake is using too much baking soda. More is not better here. It pushes texture past useful tenderizing into a mushy consistency. A second common mistake is leaving the treatment on far too long, particularly on thin cuts. Leaving it for an hour actively makes the texture worse. A third mistake is skipping the rinsing step. Every trace of baking soda needs to come off before that meat goes near a hot pan. A fourth mistake is applying this to a naturally tender cut like ribeye or fillet. Save this trick specifically for tough, lean budget cuts. A fifth mistake involves combining this with a heavy salt brine at the same time. Stacking both can create an overly altered, too soft texture. I want to bring this together with a full cost comparison and share final thoughts on what this test taught me about cheap cuts. Let's talk about cost now, since this comparison is exactly why this entire test matters beyond simply being an interesting kitchen experiment. A $1 eye of round steak, treated with roughly 1 cent worth of baking soda from a box that costs under $2, produces a result noticeably closer to a mid-range cut costing 4 or 5 times as much. This is not a small distinction for a family. Let's put real numbers against this. A family buying ribeye or strip steak regularly, at $8 to $12 per pound, spends significantly more per meal than a family buying eye of round or bottom round at $2 to $3 per pound. Add this one simple step, and that cheaper cut closes a meaningful portion of the eating experience gap between the two. For a family of 4 eating steak once a week, choosing a $2 cut over an $8 cut saves $12 per week. Over a full year, that's over $600 saved, simply by choosing the cheaper cut and spending an extra 20 minutes with baking soda. The gap between what food actually costs and what people assume they need to spend is almost always wider than people expect. Let's talk about how I'd actually recommend using this method going forward. Now that I've tested it honestly and seen real results. For weekly cooking, I'd treat this as a standard step whenever I'm working with a lean, tough, budget cut. It's not an occasional trick reserved for special circumstances. It's a basic technique worth building into your regular routine. I'd specifically reach for this method with eye of round, bottom round, top round, and any other lean cut sitting at the bottom. I would not use this method on cuts that are already tender by nature. Ribeye, fillet, or strip steak doesn't need it. For ground beef, I'd consider making that quarter teaspoon addition a regular habit, particularly with 90% lean blends. Baking soda is about as basic and natural an ingredient as exists. It's sodium bicarbonate, a naturally occurring compound. This isn't a synthetic additive or a lab-created shortcut. It's closer in spirit to salt or vinegar than to processed tenderizers. My own grandmother's version of this trick, what she called sweetening the meat, used exactly this same ingredient. This isn't a modern shortcut invented to cut corners. It's an old, simple trick that aligns perfectly with actual food science. A standard box of baking soda costs under $2 and contains enough for well over 100 applications. Store it in a cool, dry place. The same box works for cooking, baking, and this tenderizing method without needing anything special. This method improves tenderness meaningfully. It does not eliminate the fundamental differences between a lean cut and a marbled one. What this method does accomplish, reliably and repeatably, is closing a real, noticeable gap between what a cheap cut usually delivers. I want to bring this entire test full circle, walking through the complete method one more time as one clear reference. Thanks for watching. Don't dismiss a simple, cheap trick just because it sounds too easy to actually work.